but it creates some, let's just say, some social tension between those that have and those that don't. And it's about learning to use these mutations for good versus evil, and it gets into all sorts of interesting human psychology. You work on the actual real-life version of what I think of X-Men and, as you'll tell us today, women as well, which is, as you just told us, there's variation in all of our genomes, and occasionally, by virtue of the needs of a particular group or individual, those mutations afford them an incredible ability to do incredible things. So if you would, could you tell us about these underwater free divers that you've studied? This is a collection of studies, I realize, but maybe the first study, because I find this to be one of the more incredible examples of behavior shaping what we think of are fixed properties of the human body. And please just tell us about it. It's such a wonderful story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also love the X-Men, although if you ever want to ruin a perfectly good sci-fi movie, watch it with an evolutionary biologist.
Okay. Noted.
No,
Noted.
yeah, so there are these incredible people, well, really all around the world, but I started my work in Indonesia called the Bajau. They are a group of what's called sea nomads. So sea nomads they're these people who spend their whole lives essentially at sea, traditionally. They live on houseboats, and everything they need they get from the sea. And they do this through fishing, of course, and other things like that, but also through an incredible amount of breath hold diving. So they're extremely good at this. They can hold their breath for many minutes at a time. They dive to incredible depths. A lot of them wear these jewelry made of black coral. Black coral only starts growing at about 100 feet deep, so that tells you how deep they're diving.
So those are trophies.
They're actually meant to protect them from evil spirits and things like that.
How long are their breath holds on record? I've heard you talk about this before. It's a little debatable, but the number I heard from you in a lecture, I went, whoa.
Yeah. So I was told, and I always emphasize that, I was told, I did not see this, I did not record it, I was told 13 minutes. And this was by the father of a diver who I worked with in Indonesia.
That's got to be in the neighborhood of world record stuff.
It is, yeah. I'm trying to remember what the current world record is, but it's also, I mean, you have to think about if you see them diving, like it's incredibly active. So a lot of the breath hold records that we think of are people floating in a pool. They're not moving. They're not expending any, energy. They're not using up that oxygen as quickly. And these sea nomads are, when they're underwater, they look like hunters on land. They go deep enough that they're not floating anymore, and so they're walking on the surface of, the bottom of the ocean with their spear guns, and they look like hunters. It's incredible to see.
Amazing. So even if it's not 13 minutes, let's say it's half that, it's still super impressive.
It's very impressive, yeah.
So do they grow up doing this?
They do, yeah. And in fact, they spend so much time traditionally on these houseboats and so little time on land that a lot of the children actually learn to swim before they learn how to walk. So one of the divers, when I was out there, one of my colleagues noticed that one of the divers' feet was very soft. And we realized that it's because he's never really walking. He's just always in the water. So his feet don't develop the same kind of calluses that ours do because he's not using them like we do.
Amazing. So how did you find this population, and what sorts of questions did you start to ask?
Yeah, so I was actually diving as part of a coral genomics project in Thailand, escaping Danish winter, because that's where I was doing my PhD. And I heard about a population called the Moken. So that's another group of these sea nomads, and heard about their incredible underwater diving. Started looking into it and saw a study that I think you've seen that showed that Moken children could actually see underwater better than European children, and started thinking about free diving is really dangerous. And so I was thinking that this could actually be something that's driving selection in this population, that's causing this population to evolve.
In other words, just to put this in everyday terms for people, if you don't get good at this, you die.
Yeah, exactly.
If you die young enough, you don't reproduce.
Exactly.
If you get good enough at this, you can live long enough to reproduce, and your children will presumably inherit whatever mutation or genetic variants afford this ability.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we see with competitive breath hold divers, I've never actually been to one of these competitions, but I've read about them. People pass out underwater all the time, and they're pulled to the surface and revived. But if you're a sea nomad diving in the middle of the ocean with no one nearby, nobody's going to pull you out of that water, and so you've just removed yourself from the gene pool completely. Whereas someone who maybe has a variation or has genetic variation that's making them safer at diving might survive that.
And in this case, the safety at diving comes from being able to stay under longer. We can talk about that. But as long as we're on this point, and because some people will be tempted to go test their breath holding time, which please don't do it. I'm just going to do it across the board. Just don't do it. Learn from an expert. If you're going to learn to free dive, learn from somebody who's truly expert under the right conditions. I'll put a link to a couple folks I know that I have no business relation to, Mark Healy and some other people that teach this on land first. Actually, you know what? I'll just tell you, you know what they told me was the first step
What?
in one of these free diving classes. I chose not to do it, is to do not do this. But I was told, here's the first step. You're going to hold your breath on land and force yourself to not breathe when the gasp reflex hits until you pass out.
Yes.
And I was like, you know what? I'm not going to take this course.
Yeah. So this is exactly what gets people in trouble because, we don't have a reliable sensor for when our oxygen is low. And so that happens to people underwater because that feeling, wanting to breathe is a buildup of carbon dioxide. And so, people teach themselves to overcome it, like they're suggesting you do there. And then, you're underwater and you pass out and that's it.
I've been told that you go from feeling that gasp reflex, you learn to ride that like a bump, the same way you might stay in a cold plunge or something a little bit longer than your impulse would have you stay in. But in this case, you're underwater, and then it passes, and then you're swimming freely about, and you feel good, you're relaxed, you're doing slow exhales to let off that carbon dioxide, whatever carbon dioxide is left, and then it's just lights out.
Yeah.
That there's no flickering. It just goes to complete blackout, like curtains, as they call it. And then you're dead, unless somebody pulls you up to the surface.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully we sufficiently scared people into doing this. Okay, so this population presumably is not thinking about carbon dioxide thresholds for the gasp reflex, areas of the brainstem that are measuring carbon dioxide. They presumably learn through experience that if you do the right things, you live and reproduce, your family eats. You do the wrong things, you die.
Right. Yeah. There's so much cultural knowledge that's integrated into the practice and that's passed on from, generation to generation, because a lot of times they're doing this in family units. One of the divers that I worked with, his dad used to be the most famous diver in the village. Now he's the most famous diver in the village. And so there's a lot of that tradition and that traditional knowledge that's passed on, despite it maybe not looking like what we would read in a textbook.
When you say one of the most revered or expert divers, I'm very curious as to how this weaves back to an earlier part of our conversation. Is prowess at diving based on how long someone can stay under? And is prowess at diving, because it correlates with the ability to secure resources, is that somehow correlated with desirable mate? Do these people tend to have more offspring than people that are not as good at diving? And of course, there are confounds here, like you can imagine differences in hormone levels to begin with, eating more during puberty and growing, stronger or whatever it is, or more or smarter, and not just smarter. But do you see this? Like, are the people who are great divers in the village, do they tend to be the ones with more children, to be direct?
It would be interesting to count that. I think now, things are changing for the Bajau, at least the community that I worked with, where a lot of people are moving away from traditional diving and into other kinds of fishing practices. And so I think at this point, this prowess, this respect for these divers is more respect for the fact that they're keeping the tradition alive and they're continuing this tradition, even though it's a very hard thing to do. But yeah, it would be really interesting. I know actually the one diver came from a very big family, and that was something that the Bajau actually asked me about, was why do the Bajau have so many children? And so it would be interesting to see if diving success correlates with reproductive success, because you could imagine that it would. I mean, they're diving for things that they're eating, so why wouldn't that increase your success on that?
Just out of curiosity, and because I like seafood, what are they fishing for?
They dive for, it depends on where they are. They're spearing a lot of fish. Everything is delicious. They dive for shellfish. They also harvest seaweed sometimes. And they actually collect a lot of sea cucumbers, which they dry out in the sun and then eat later.
It's like pure protein.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. So what did you study in this group?
Yeah, so we started thinking about, okay, for natural selection to act in this population, it needs some kind of physical trait to act on, which got us looking at the dive reflex, or the mammalian dive reflex. So this is, if anyone, and again, I hesitate to tell people to do this, but if you hold your breath and put your face in a bowl full of cold water, your body responds as if you're diving. And what that means is that your heart rate slows down. Your blood vessels in your extremities constrict because, your fingers will be okay with a little bit less oxygen, but your brain really needs that oxygen. So it's keeping the blood central where you need it the most. And then your spleen contracts. And so the spleen certainly wasn't the first organ that I thought about when thinking about diving, but the spleen is a reservoir. I mean, the spleen does many things, but one of the things that it does is it's a reservoir for red blood cells that are carrying oxygen. And so through that contraction, those oxygen-rich red blood cells are now pushed into circulation, and you get an oxygen boost.
How significant is that oxygen boost?
It's about 10% in most of us.
That's pretty impressive.
Exactly. Yeah. It's enough to make a difference.
Yeah. By comparison, there are a lot of discussions online about, if you finish your exercise, resistance training or cardiovascular exercise with a brief sauna session, so going slightly hyperthermic, right? You have to hydrate, et cetera, but it actually works even better. As long as we're talking about dangerous practices, it works even better if you're slightly dehydrated. You get an overproduction of red blood cells in the subsequent days, and this is used for a performance-enhancing effect in elite athletes mainly. You have to, again, avoid dehydration, death, et cetera, but this is done, and someone will correct me, but the shift in available oxygen is in the low percentages, like 1 or 2%.
Okay.
So this is what people are fighting for using these kind of Baroque protocols. You're talking about a 10% increase in available oxygen through a contraction of the spleen. I didn't even know the spleen could contract.
Yeah, that's right.
Just when you put your face into colder than ambient temperature water,